The adopted daughter was jealous of me. I made her regret her life choices. The day I was brought into the Reynolds family, I was too young to understand that I wasn't being adopted out of love. I was meant to be a companion, a playmate for their daughter, Emily, who was just a year older than me. But I learned quickly that I was never supposed to be her equal. At first, I tried to fit in, desperate to be accepted. I smiled through Emily's passive-aggressive jabs, ignored the way she'd snatch things from my hands just to remind me that they weren't mine to begin with. She had everything: a loving mother who doted on her, a father who brought back gifts from every business trip, and two older brothers who worshipped the ground she walked on. And yet, the moment I arrived, she decided she needed more. More attention, more praise, more proof that she was superior to me in every possible way. I was 6 when I first realized that Emily's kindness had a sharp edge. It started with little things: her accidentally spilling juice on my dress during family pictures, misplacing my schoolwork so I'd get in trouble, whispering something in our mother's ear just before I'd get scolded for something I hadn't done. Then, when we got older, she became more direct. She stole my gifts on birthdays and claimed them as her own. Any time a boy showed interest in me, she'd swoop in with a laugh and a flick of her blonde hair, just to prove she could take whatever she wanted. I let her win every time. Not because I was weak, but because I understood something Emily never did. Real power doesn't come from petty victories. It comes from patience. From knowing when to step back, when to play the part of the overlooked. By the time we reached high school, I had perfected the art of being unremarkable. I dressed simply, kept my grades steady but not extraordinary, and never fought back when Emily tried to overshadow me. She thought she was winning, but I was simply waiting. The night before graduation, I sat alone in my room, staring at the acceptance letter that had arrived a month earlier. A full-ride scholarship to a prestigious university. My ticket out. I had told no one. I folded the letter and tucked it deep inside my backpack, placing a different envelope, the one with my trade school application, on my desk where my parents would see it in the morning. Emily had spent years trying to crush me beneath her, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of knowing she hadn't succeeded. If she believed I was going to stay behind, struggling to make ends meet, she'd grow bored. She'd move on. I should have known better than to underestimate her. The next morning, I found my trade school application in the trash, torn to pieces. My heart clenched, but I didn't let the panic show on my face. I simply grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and walked into the kitchen where my parents were drinking coffee. Emily sat at the counter, scrolling through her phone like she hadn't just sabotaged my plans. I cleared my throat. "Mom, Dad, I wanted to ask for some help." They both looked up. My father set his mug down, his eyes sharp with quiet disinterest. My mother, more expressive, arched a thin brow. "Help with what, dear?" I hesitated. I was hoping you could help with tuition for trade school. Just for the first semester." Emily didn't even try to hide her smirk. My mother sighed, shaking her head. "Sweetheart, we've done so much for you already. Don't you think it's time you learned some independence?" Independence. What a convenient word to use when you had never once needed to stand on your own. I swallowed back the bitterness rising in my throat. "Of course. I understand." I turned to leave, but Emily's voice stopped me. "Oh, don't look so sad," she cooed, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "Maybe you can find a job in town. Stick around. You never know what opportunities will come up." For a second, I almost laughed. Emily thought she had won. She thought she had successfully trapped me in this small, suffocating life she had crafted for me. But she didn't know about the letter in my bag. Didn't know that in less than 24 hours, I would be on a bus heading to a city where she held no power. So I did what I always did. I let her believe she had beaten me. I forced a smile and nodded. "Maybe you're right." Then I turned, walked out the door, and left the Reynolds family behind. The first few months at university were the hardest I had ever faced. Without family support, I worked 2 jobs to afford the things my scholarship didn't cover. I barely slept, surviving on instant ramen and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had escaped. I kept my distance from my past, But life has a cruel way of dragging you back when you least expect it. 3 years later, I found myself in a familiar place, standing on the sidewalk outside my childhood home, staring up at the windows that had once trapped me in. I hadn't come back for them. I had come back because my master's program required research on community structures, and my old neighborhood was a perfect study. But being here felt like stepping into the past. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice I hadn't expected. Well, if it isn't the Great Escape Artist. I spun around to see Jake Carter leaning against his truck, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. He had been our neighbor for years, always watching from the sidelines as Emily tormented me. Unlike the others, he had never played along with her games. He had never fallen for her charm. I raised a brow. Jake, you're back. For now. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head. You know, Emily told everyone you ran off and failed. Said you couldn't hack it out there on your own. I felt a flicker of amusement. Did she? His smirk widened. Yeah. Guess she won't like the truth then. I looked back at the house, my chest tightening with old wounds and fresh determination. No, she won't. Because Emily had spent years trying to make me feel small, insignificant. But I wasn't the same girl who had walked away without looking back. And this time, I had no intention of letting her win. The moment I stepped back into my old town, I felt it. The weight of everything I'd left behind pressing against my chest like a hand trying to push me down. The streets were the same, the people still familiar, but I wasn't the same girl who had walked away years ago with nothing but a scholarship and a fierce determination to carve out a life beyond Emily's grasp. Jake's gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. So, what's the real reason you're back? I shrugged, feigning indifference. Work, he scoffed. Work? In this place? You expect me to believe that? I hesitated, then sighed. It's for my master's program. I'm doing research. His eyebrows shot up. Master's program? I smirked. Yeah. Turns out I didn't fail after all. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Emily's gonna lose her mind. I met his eyes, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something other than resentment for my past. Maybe, just maybe, coming back wasn't a mistake after all. I didn't plan to see my family yet. I had come to town for research, nothing more. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself wandering the streets, drawn toward the places that had once been mine. The old bookstore where I used to hide from Emily's cruelty, the diner where I'd worked my first job, the park where I had first met Jake. I paused at the entrance of the park, memories flooding back with startling clarity. It had been the summer before high school, and I had been sitting on the swings clutching a small, wrapped box in my hands. A gift from Jake, given without ceremony. Inside had been a delicate silver bracelet, a simple chain with a tiny star charm. For luck, he had said, his tone casual, but his eyes kind. I had worn it every day after that, a quiet reminder that someone had seen me, really seen me, beyond Emily's shadow. And then, one day, it was gone. Emily had taken it. She had flaunted it in front of me, laughed when I demanded it back, then accidentally lost it a week later. I had cried that night, not for the bracelet itself, but for what it had meant, that no matter what I had, she would always take it from me. But she couldn't take everything. I reached up, running my fingers over my collarbone, where a different charm now rested, a small gold pendant, a gift I had bought for myself the day I graduated with honors. A symbol of my own strength. I turned away from the park and walked on. I had no interest in reliving the past. The first encounter with my family happened by accident. I had stopped at a cafe near the town square, flipping through my notes when I heard my name spoken in the sharp, condescending tone I had never forgotten. Can't believe she actually came back. Emily's voice cut through the cafe's chatter. Probably failed out of whatever school she scammed her way into. I closed my notebook and slowly turned. Emily stood by the counter, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer purse slung over her arm. Next to her stood our mother, watching with the same critical gaze she had always reserved for me. I set my coffee down and stood, walking toward them with measured steps. Emily's smirk faltered when she got a proper look at me. I was no longer the timid girl she had once controlled. I didn't fail, I said coolly, meeting her gaze. In fact, I'm doing quite well. Emily scoffed, but there was an unease in her expression. Oh, and what exactly are you doing here then? Research. For my master's program. Silence. My mother's brow furrowed, but Emily's lips twisted into a sneer. Master's program? You? Please. Jake's voice cut in before I could reply.
Yeah, her.
She's always been smarter than you gave her credit for. I turned to see him standing behind me, his hands in his pockets, eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. Emily's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. Jake smirked, looking directly at my mother. You should be proud of her. She did what none of you thought she could. Emily's jaw clenched, her nails digging into her purse strap. Well, isn't that sweet? She spat. Too bad no one actually cares. I exhaled slowly, refusing to let her get under my skin. You know, Emily, I used to let you define me. I let you steal from me, belittle me, convince everyone I was nothing. But you know what I realized? She didn't answer, but her silence was telling. I never needed your approval, and I certainly don't need it now. With that, I turned on my heel and walked away, Jake falling into step beside me. That was satisfying, he murmured, glancing at me. You okay? I nodded, a slow smile forming. More than okay. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was standing tall. And Emily was the one left in my shadow. The morning air was crisp, a thin layer of frost clinging to the edges of the town sidewalks as I walked toward the library. It had been years since I had stepped foot in the building, but the sight of it still stirred something in me. Nostalgia mixed with a bitter reminder of all the times I had used this place to escape Emily's cruelty. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the scent of old books and polished oak filling my lungs. My research had brought me back here, but a part of me knew that coming home meant facing unfinished business. Avoiding Emily and my family forever wasn't realistic, and after yesterday's encounter at the cafe, I knew she would do everything in her power to make my life difficult while I was in town. Back so soon? I turned to see Jake leaning against one of the tall bookshelves, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on his face. He had always been good at appearing wherever I least expected him. I have work to do, I said simply, holding up my notebook as if to prove my point. Jake chuckled.
Right.
Because this is all about research. I sighed, shaking my head. What do you want, Jake? He pushed off the shelf and stepped closer, his expression turning more serious. I want to know why you're really here. I frowned. I already told you. Yeah. Master's program. Research. But you could have done that anywhere. Why here? Why now? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the spine of my notebook. The truth was, part of me had wanted to prove something, to myself, to my family, to Emily. I had spent years trying to move on, but some wounds never truly healed until you face them head-on. I guess, I exhaled slowly. I needed to see if coming back still had power over me. If she still had power over me. Jake studied me for a moment before nodding. Fair enough. But don't let Emily drag you back into her games. She thrives on making people miserable. I know. He smiled slightly.
Good.
Because I'd hate to see you get hurt again. I swallowed, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. Before I could respond, the library doors swung open, and a familiar voice cut through the quiet space like a blade. Well, isn't this cozy? Emily. She walked toward us, her heels clicking against the floor with practiced precision. She looked as flawless as ever, polished, poised, and full of barely concealed venom. The sight of her still sent a shiver down my spine, but this time, I refused to shrink under her gaze. Didn't think you'd be hanging around town long enough to make friends, she said, tilting her head as her sharp blue eyes flicked toward Jake. Jake sighed. Emily, don't start. Emily's lips curled into a saccharine smile. Oh, come on, Jake. It's just so funny, isn't it? Our little runaway comes back, acting all accomplished, and suddenly, she thinks she belongs. I met her gaze head-on. I never needed to belong to this place, Emily. That was always your obsession, not mine. Something flickered across her face. Anger, maybe, or the frustration of realizing that I wasn't the same girl she used to manipulate. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. You think just because you got a degree, you're better than me? I shook my head.
No, Emily.
I think I'm better than the person you wanted me to be. For a brief moment, her mask slipped. But then she recovered, letting out a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, congratulations. Too bad, no one actually cares. Jake scoffed. You always say that, but you sure seem to care a whole lot about her business. Emily's smile faltered for half a second before she flipped her hair over her shoulder. Whatever. I have better things to do. She turned on her heel and stalked off, but not before throwing me one last glance, filled with unspoken threats. I knew Emily well enough to understand that this wasn't over. She wasn't the type to let go of a grudge, especially not when she felt like she was losing control. Jake let out a low whistle. She's really not handling this well, huh? No, I admitted. She's not. He studied me for a long moment. You gonna be okay? I squared my shoulders, forcing a small smile. I think I already am. That night, I sat in my rented apartment, scrolling through old photos on my laptop. Most of them were from my college years. Pictures of friends, of late-night study sessions, of a life that felt like it had been carved out of sheer willpower. Then, I came across an old photo I hadn't seen in years. It was blurry, taken in the backyard of the Reynolds house, back when I was about 15. In the photo, I was wearing an oversized hoodie, Jake's hoodie. It had been a cold night, and he had thrown it over my shoulders without thinking twice. I remembered that night vividly. We had been sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars while Emily and her friends gossiped inside. I had been feeling particularly invisible that evening, lost in the shadow of her constant need to be the center of attention. You ever think about leaving? I had asked him. Jake had shrugged.
Sure.
But leaving and never looking back? That's different. I had pulled the hoodie tighter around me, breathing in the faint scent of bonfire smoke.
Yeah.
That was the first time I had really let myself dream about a future beyond this town, beyond Emily's grasp. And now here I was back again, but on my own terms. A message popped up on my screen, pulling me from my thoughts. Jake, you up? I smiled slightly before typing back.
Yeah.
Couldn't sleep. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed. You want to get out of here for a bit? I hesitated, then typed back. Where to? Jake. Someplace where Emily can't find you. I exhaled, a strange sense of relief settling over me. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't facing this alone after all. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. The moment I stepped back into my old town, I knew something was off. The whispers, the sideways glances, the way people suddenly seemed to have an opinion about my life, even though I had been gone for years. Something had been set in motion long before I arrived. Emily wasn't just bitter that I had returned. She was planning something. And this time, I wasn't about to let her catch me off guard. Jake noticed it, too. She's up to something, he murmured as we sat at a diner, sipping coffee. She's been too quiet since you got back. I set my cup down and met his gaze. Let her try. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The first real confrontation came when I least expected it. I had been walking through the town square, taking in the places that had once been familiar. The bookstore where I used to hide when Emily's antics became unbearable. The bakery that still smelled of warm cinnamon and butter. The streets that had once felt like a prison now seemed smaller, like a stage where the same old play continued without me. Then I saw her, Claire. Claire had once been my closest friend, the only person I had trusted enough to confide in when Emily's cruelty became too much. But the moment I left town, she had chosen her side, aligning herself with Emily like so many others had. And now, here she was, standing in my path, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "So it's true," she said, tilting her head. "You're back." I forced a neutral expression. "For now." She let out a sharp laugh. "Didn't think you'd have the guts." I narrowed my eyes. "Didn't think you'd still be taking orders from Emily." Her jaw tensed, but she recovered quickly. "I don't take orders from anyone. But you have to understand, after you left, Emily, she made sure no one remembered you fondly." I had expected this. Still, hearing it out loud made my stomach clench. She always did like rewriting history. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You should have told me, that you were leaving for good. I thought we were friends." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Friends? You let her ruin me. You watched her steal from me, humiliate me, and when I was finally free, you helped her turn the whole town against me." She flinched. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice." She exhaled, something like regret flickering in her eyes. "You don't get it, do you? Emily doesn't let go of grudges. She's not done with you." I already knew that, but hearing Claire confirm it sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Let her try," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not the same girl she used to control." Claire hesitated, then shook her head. "You have no idea what she's capable of now." I held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away. As I moved through the square, the weight of Claire's warning settled over me. Emily had already sabotaged me once before, and if she had her way, she'd do it again. But this time I was ready. Jake was waiting for me when I returned to my rented apartment. He was leaning against his truck, arms crossed, looking like he had been there for a while. "Well," he asked. I sighed. "Emily's got plans." And Claire made sure I knew it. He nodded, unsurprised. "She's been stirring up drama since she heard you were back. But the thing about Emily? She always thinks she's the smartest person in the room." I studied him. "And you?" His smirk was slow, confident. "I know better." A small spark of something, hope, maybe, flickered in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone in this fight. Emily thought she could still control me, still dictate how my story would unfold. She was wrong, and I was going to prove it. The next few days passed in a blur, but the weight of Claire's warning lingered. I could feel Emily's presence everywhere, like a shadow creeping just beyond my line of sight. People in town had started looking at me differently, their hushed whispers trailing behind me wherever I went. Something was coming. I just didn't know what yet. Jake and I sat in the diner late one evening, nursing cups of coffee as he drummed his fingers on the table. "She's waiting," he finally said. "She wants you to make the first move." I exhaled sharply, leaning back against the booth. "I won't." "That's what she wants, to drag me into one of her games." Jake smirked. "Yeah, but she's not patient. She'll crack first." I wanted to believe him. But Emily had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, of getting people to turn against me. And now, with me back in town, she wasn't just going to sit back and let me exist. I was proven right the very next morning. I woke up to a string of messages. Some from unknown numbers, others from old classmates I hadn't spoken to in years. "You really think you can just show up and pretend like nothing happened?"
Wow.
"I heard about what you did. Unreal. Did you really steal money from your own family?" I sat up abruptly, heart pounding as I scrolled through the messages. My hands trembled as I opened my email and found more of the same. Then my phone rang.
Jake.
I answered immediately. "What the hell is going on? You haven't seen it?" His voice was sharp, alert. "Seen what?" There was a brief pause, then I heard him curse under his breath. "Check the town's community page. Now." With shaking fingers, I pulled up the local social media group. And there it was, right at the top. A post. A carefully worded story about how I had supposedly stolen thousands of dollars from my adoptive parents before running away in disgrace. Comments flooded the post, people I barely remembered chiming in with their opinions, speculating, condemning. I always knew she was trouble. She never appreciated what they did for her. Emily always tried to help her, and this is how she repays them? My throat closed. A cold, sinking feeling settled in my gut. Jake's voice cut through my panic. It's a lie. And anyone with half a brain knows it. I swallowed hard. But that won't stop them from believing it. A long pause. Then, what are you going to do? My first instinct was to hide. To disappear the way I had before.
But something inside me snapped.
This wasn't just a rumor. This was Emily making her move, trying to destroy me before I could even begin to build something here. And I was done letting her win. I tightened my grip on my phone. I'm going to fight back. It didn't take long to figure out where Emily would be that afternoon. The Reynolds family was nothing if not predictable, and Emily never missed a chance to be seen in all the right places. I found her at the country club, sitting with a group of women who had once been our classmates. The moment I walked in, conversation at the table hushed. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment heavy in the air. But I only cared about one person. Emily looked up at me, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across her lips. Well, look who finally decided to show her face. I crossed my arms. You're getting desperate. She feigned a look of innocence. Whatever do you mean? I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only she could hear. The fake accusations. The town gossip. You're running out of ways to control me, so now you're just making things up. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the slight tightening of her jaw. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, voice saccharine. I don't have to make things up. People believe what they want to believe. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. Then let's see what happens when they hear the truth. Emily chuckled, shaking her head. The truth? Do you think that matters? People love a villain, and I've made sure they see you as one. I wanted to scream at her, wanted to shake her and demand to know why she hated me so much, why she had spent her entire life trying to tear me down. But I knew better. Emily thrived on control. And the best way to take that away from her was simple. I turned to leave. You always go too far, I said quietly. And one day, it's going to catch up with you. She didn't respond. But as I walked away, I felt the first real shift in the air. Emily had played her hand too soon. And I wasn't done fighting. Later that night, Jake and I sat in his truck outside my apartment, watching as notifications flooded my phone. The town was still talking. But something was changing. Jake tapped the screen of his phone. I talked to a few people. Showed them proof that you've been working and studying nonstop since you left. Some of them are starting to doubt Emily's version of things. I exhaled. It's not enough. No, he agreed. But it's a start. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. Emily had spent years weaving a web of lies. It was time to tear it apart. And I was just getting started. The moment of truth had arrived. Emily had always underestimated me, always believed she could manipulate and sabotage my life without consequence. But this time, she had overplayed her hand. The confrontation at the Reynolds family gathering had shaken everyone. My parents, faced with the undeniable truth of Emily's cruelty, were silent for once. Jake stood beside me, unwavering, as I looked Emily in the eye. You tried to break me, I said, my voice steady. You failed. Emily scoffed, but the flicker of doubt in her gaze betrayed her. For the first time, she was the one losing control. The room was thick with tension. I could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. My mother looked as though she wanted to defend Emily, but something held her back. Perhaps the years of willful ignorance finally catching up to her. Jake stepped forward then, his voice slicing through the silence. You all let this happen. You let her treat her like she was nothing while pretending it was normal. Emily's face twisted in anger. Oh, spare me the dramatics, Jake.
She's always been pathetic.
Running away didn't change that. I felt something inside me snap, not with anger, but with clarity. Emily wasn't powerful. She never had been. She had simply relied on the blind loyalty of those around her to fuel her cruelty. I turned to my parents, my voice calm but firm. I deserved better. And the fact that none of you ever saw it until now says everything. The murmurs began then. relatives shifting uncomfortably, the weight of truth settling over them like an unwelcome guest. I watched as my father's mouth tightened, as if grappling with something he wasn't ready to admit. Emily tried again, her voice sharper now. So what? You think you're better than us just because you got out? I met her gaze, without hesitation.
No.
But I am free. And with that, I turned on my heel, walking away from the house and the past that had once held me captive. The murmurs grew louder behind me, but I didn't stop. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running. I was rising.